Welcome to Perspectives El Paso. I'm Leon Blevins with El Paso Community College Television. This is November of 2016. The program probably will show in December. We just finished a presidential election. The presidential election and also some state, congressional, U.S. Senate elections. I started running for president in 1964. I was teaching in a small high school in Holtville, California, close to El Centro. I walked into a classroom one day. The election of 1964 was going on between Barry Goldwater, a Republican, very conservative Republican, and Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat from Texas. And some people were saying they didn't like either one of those candidates. I walked into a class and a couple of young men carrying on a conversation and said, "Mr. Blevins, we just decided you should run for President of the United States. Our parents are discussing voting for write-in vote for Mickey Mouse or What Me Worry, the Mad Magazine character, or Pat Paulson, a comic on television." I said, "Okay, as of now, I'm throwing my hat in the ring. I'm running for President of the United States. Give me some money. I need money to run." You know, we had an election this year that was very similar to that, in that Hillary Clinton, a Democrat, ran, and Donald Trump, a Republican, ran, and millions of people were saying they didn't like either candidate. And some actually did write in their own names or the name of someone else in this election, and Donald Trump won. I have two very special guest friends of mine from the government department at El Paso Community College, and we're going to talk about the election. I have with me closest here is Blayne Primovich, now a dean. What are you dean over? What's the title?
I am Dean of Communication and Performing Arts at the Via Verde campus.
Okay. And Sergio Saenz-Rivera. Okay, Saenz-Rivera. Here I'm on the border all these years, still have trouble getting your name right.
It's hard.
A lot of people have trouble getting my name right, okay?
That's
now my question to both of you, and let's get a little conversation going here, was we know what happened. Now the question is, why? Let's start with you, Sergio. Why?
My guess is that comes from the candidate, as you say, that wasn't very attractive because of her past linkages to her husband,
Okay.
Clinton. But the other is the Democratic Party misreading of who the voters were. I think that the Democratic Party appealed too much to minorities, or they make immigration the issue of their platform, and these things that pertain more to minorities, where they ignore the economic part. And they failed to attract that social class that Bernie Sanders was very good in attracting, which was the American white working class from the Midwest.
And Bernie Sanders, a Democrat.
Okay. Yes, the Democrat, that's correct. So it's both the candidate and the Democrats, and the inability of political scientists like us to predict what was going to happen.
Okay, you have anything else? Why?
Well, I think we've seen alternating political dynasties between Clinton and Bush. And then we've seen polarization between the two parties growing and growing through the 1990s and the 2000s. And I think there was an increasing segment of society feeling left out because of globalization, because of economic decline. And I think that segment of the population that had felt their voice has been left out, and it felt that politics as usual, alternating between the two parties and the two political dynasties, simply wasn't getting the job done.
Another thing neither of you mentioned, I don't believe, is that the bubbles on either side of the country, Los Angeles to San Francisco, and that category of people in our society and in the economic part of our society, and then the New York City to Washington, D.C., that area. And sometimes that was misread because the middle America did not feel like these elites on either side. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think that goes back to the two-party alignments that we've seen as well. That essentially what we heard in this election, for the most part, was the same party lines, the same issue positions that we've heard for 20 to 30 years.
But dominated by groups on either side of the country and leaving out those in the middle?
I think the two-party alignments have. And I think this was the election where that, whether you call it the silent voters or the silent Republicans, the silent majority, however you want to characterize it, but I think this was the Midwest, the heartland, the old Rust Belt workers who feel that both parties have left them behind in support of free trade, in support of globalization, and simply were feeling economically insecure.
Now, we kept hearing about NAFTA in this, and the free trade agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement, that if I remember, George W. Bush started this, or George Bush, the first Bush president, and then Clinton comes in and he signs off on it. And those in the upper Midwest begin to see the decline of their cities, their jobs leaving, going to Mexico, and
China.
people wanting to get into China. So people wanting, that group of people that saw this happening to them wanted to change, and Donald Trump was saying, if I get in, I'm going to do away with NAFTA. Did you hear any discussion about this here on the border very much during this campaign?
Oh yeah, NAFTA, you gotta remember that NAFTA was passed by the elites of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. The industrial elites needed a more free flow passage of capital and merchandises across the border. They were the ones that pushed the agreement, the treaty. And then, sadly for the three countries, there were losses, there were wins as well. But I guess for the American worker, it's only been a loss because all those manufacturing jobs cannot remain here in America. They went elsewhere because the American worker gets a high salary, and it's just a matter of cost of production. You go produce where it's cheaper to produce. And for Mexico, they thought that they were going to get from Mexico at least the cheap labor. And what ended up happening is that the Mexican income rose, so the middle classes don't want to do those jobs either. And those jobs left Mexico too, and now they're in China. So that process of when Trump says we're renegotiating NAFTA, let's see which producers want to bring back their production here. Because you can renegotiate whatever you want, but who's going to bring the factories? And that's, to me, a questionable promise.
Okay, at the time that happened, I remember the battle cry for the Democrats was, it's the economy, stupid. But they seem to have forgotten about that in this election. And I understand Bill Clinton was urging his wife and others in her campaign to start focusing more on that, the economy, and she was focusing more in her operatives on the social issues, the ethnic issues and so on. Now let's take Donald Trump. I keep hearing people say in the media and the general public, this is an election like none others, okay? And the way that Donald Trump conducted the election, wiping out all of his opponents in the primaries in the Republican Party, and then, of course, winning the election. What do you think about the way that he conducted the election with the negativity toward groups, Mexicans, Muslims, and so on? Blayne, start that.
Well, that was kind of interesting because in its own way, he became another Teflon type of candidate, that no matter what outlandish thing he said, none of it really had any negative repercussions on his standing in the polls, on his placement in the race. And then even as we found out on election day, it didn't really hurt him in voters any worse than any other Republican candidate that we've seen. And the whole emphasis on anti-Muslim sentiment from exit polls going back to November 8th, Muslim voters made up less than 1% of total voters there. And Latino voters split pretty much the same way they had for Mitt Romney, maybe just a couple percentage points less than for George Bush. But it really didn't seem to stick. And I think that for the voters who were supporting him, he was simply mimicking sentiments those voters already held, or at some level, they were voting for the anti-establishment candidate, and they didn't really care what their candidate was saying or promising. It was simply that he wasn't the establishment, and at that level, he couldn't lose those voters.
Yeah, just want to change.
Yeah. For me, I mean, from the perspective of a political scientist, to me, the way he ran his campaign was brilliant. Because just from a very neutral point of view, to me as a Mexican, it's horrific. But as an analyst of politics, it's brilliant because he could exploit those strands of sentiments and feelings that buried in in the melange of multiculturalism, but are still very alive and very present. And he knew how to channel. And let's make a statement that Trump is a master of the media. Like, he's been in the TV and he knows how to handle this. And the most, he himself said it. Like, I send a tweet.
You're tweeting.
I send a tweet and 50 millions listen to me, and I pay $1 million and I have 1 minute on TV paid. But this is free advertisement, right?
Well, he got a lot of free got a lot of free from cable television too.
And nobody saw that. Like, he apparently knew what he was doing, and it worked. It worked.
Well, what about the polls? You mentioned the polls. Why were the polls so wrong on this? They kept predicting that Hillary had it. She had a pretty good lead until things happened. What happened with the polls? Sergio, you start this one first.
The polls had it all wrong. There are very esoteric statistical models in some universities that got it right, but nobody listens to those. It's like everybody listens to the New York Times, the CNN polls, and they all got it wrong, right? And the polls are very inexact. It's not a science. It includes many variables, and it's hard to read the elections. But I guess in regards to statistics, it's surprising that the main companies that do this for a living didn't get it.
Were you surprised?
No, actually, I was among a small group of people that called this election a few weeks ago, and precisely because of what I saw in the polls. So I'm going to mix things up a little bit and argue that the polls really weren't wrong. After all, they predicted a Hillary Clinton victory in the national polls, and she won the national vote. She won the popular vote. The problem with the polls in a close race is that the Electoral College is based on the state-by-state vote, and state polls are historically less accurate than the national polling data that we see. And what all the national polls and the state-level polls showed was a very close narrowing of the race in the last 2 weeks. And historically, we know polls have a hard time dealing with those last-minute voters, with last-minute shifts of opinion. And Donald Trump, to the extent that he did pour a lot of money into the race, poured it into that last weekend before November 8th. In fact, watching football that whole Sunday, it was nothing but commercial break to a Trump commercial, followed by a Trump commercial, followed by a Trump commercial. And he won those last-minute voters, and those state polls where he came out ahead in Pennsylvania and Florida and Ohio really were all within the margin of error. And I think, if anything, this election showed us that the margin of error sometimes rears up and goes against the popular narrative.
Well, my prediction of Trump winning, in a sense, went back to the day that he announced he was running. And he came down the escalator and he called Mexicans rapists and criminals. And some of my students, I hadn't retired at that time, and some of the students asked, you think he could really win as president? And I said, yes. Why? And here was my answer. It was a sociological kind of answer. I said, because in modern times, in recent decades, we become much meaner as a people, mean-spirited people, road rage, all this stuff. We become more culturally crude and vulgar, and all of the things we see, access to all kinds of images on television of sex and violence. And he appeals to all of those kind of things. He plays emotions. So it's possible that even a crude, foul-mouthed person like him could win. Yeah. They didn't predict that he would wipe out everybody, but there was a possibility he could. And he went through all of the primaries and bad-mouthed people and wiped out his opponents in the primaries. Then goes into the general. Any thoughts about that?
He did beat the opponents, but you also, if you look at the popular vote in the states where Trump voted or Hillary lost, you would see that the third-party candidates did make inroads. So it wasn't the candidate and the polls, and it was also, I remember this morning I checked, Florida, Hillary needed 26,000 votes to win, and there were 192,000 third-party voters. So that also changed the election and changed the way the polls would have predicted that, because the polls normally don't concentrate on the two candidates or the main polls. Right.
And yet Jerry Johnson, the candidate of the minority party, would say it wasn't his fault.
Yeah.
As Ralph Nader said when he affected an election years ago, he said, it was not my fault. They had a right to make the choice if they want to vote for a minor party candidate. Why should I drop out just so another candidate can win? And you teach politics, you discuss these things in your class, don't you?
Absolutely.
Well, and I tend to agree with Gary Johnson on that point. I know a lot of people created a campaign that said a vote for Gary Johnson, a vote for Jill Stein as a vote for my opponent, because we heard this argument actually both from the Trump campaign and from the Clinton campaign. But at some other level, the voters making a conscious decision to move away from both major party candidates. And so that's a failure on the part of the major parties to keep their base and to keep the independent vote with them. And at the same time, those voters who did move away from the major party candidates were telling the two parties something, that neither of your candidates appealed to me, the voter, and neither of your parties have a platform that necessarily represents all that I am and all that I believe. And I think it's actually important for voters to make that choice and to vote for third-party candidates, which essentially tells the two parties that it is time to change. We've been, in political science terms, we've been long overdue for a realignment of the two parties.
It's like a battleship, it doesn't turn quickly.
No,
It's very,
and
very
we haven't
slow.
seen either party revamp their platform.
Do you have any suggestions for changing primaries? I remember when we used to have very few primaries. Of course, prior to that, you had conventions deciding, party bosses deciding who's going to run for office. Do we need to revamp? Do the parties need to rewrite their rules and change the way the primaries work? Regional primaries, for example, or whatever they could do?
I think that compared to other countries, the primaries of the United States are wonderful because they represent a vast diversity of regions, you know, and it amalgamates and ends up in a very few outline bullet points of what people want, and the candidate is the amalgamation of these forces, regional forces. Other countries don't have that. There's no perfect
No.
primary. It's not going to give you better candidates.
It also drives up the cost of running for office
Well,
because they're flitting
Quite
from
a bit.
state to state to state to state. That's expensive to do that. And I've had candidates, potential presidential candidates, when I was very involved in politics here, tell me personally, it's too expensive to run in Texas because you have so many media markets. So we have this fact that it's very expensive in the way you reach people. You just mentioned that Donald Trump put a lot of ads out at the last minute. They were undoubtedly very negative ads, and that helped him to get over.
Yeah.
What about that? Changes with the media? There's no equal time anymore, any of that?
Well, there's really not. I think we're actually going back to a media that's closer to the original media around the time of Washington and Adams and Jefferson, which was originally very partisan in nature. And people read what they agreed with. And so there's been so much talk now that because of social media, that essentially all of the news and stories that they want about politicians, celebrities, is tailored to them. And so everything is reinforcing in nature to what a person already believes and is not really something meant to explore diversity of ideas or contrary opinions or even fact for that matter. I think that's been one of the most troubling aspects of the social media explosion is just the fake news stories that go viral very quickly. But again, going back to the early days of the United States, the partisan press wasn't much more factual.
No, that's true.
In its own way. So
What's really big change here is the Facebook and Twitter, where say Donald Trump can go, or any other candidate can go directly to their mass of people in little short bites and telling them information and shaping the way they're thinking, all getting it at the same time. Is that scary or is that good?
Well, the candidates, they have people that know the modern world, and that's how the modern world communicates in sound bites, sound pieces, catchy phrases, you know. But you were talking about the polarization of ideology in the coasts, right? The coast versus the middle of the country.
Right.
I believe that you're giving a lot of credit to the political discourse of America. I think it has diminished in quality because of the media, because the media simplifies and reduces everything. The people before this era had to discuss and mobilize and attend meetings, not call the cell phone, not watch Facebook, right? And they had more time to reflect and so equating. It's very scary that the political discourse has reduced to a soundbite or to a headline or a tweet.
Right.
That's you read speeches in 1968 to get rid of the war in Vietnam, end the war in Vietnam, end the draft, and whereas now somebody would, if they want to say the same, end the draft.
Yeah.
That's all you need to do. You don't need to go march a 1 million man march in Washington anymore.
And those short bites, they appeal to
It's
emotion
scary.
rather than logic.
Yeah,
What about
it's
it, Blayne?
scary.
Well, they do. And again, the campaign's built on targeting messaging. And so the campaigns build just databases of addresses, of email accounts, Twitter accounts. And so when a campaign wants to go to their voters and mobilize them, then it's just a matter of going to the database. And I think there's less effort now put on mobilizing the average voter or even the average American who's not a strong partisan supporter, who's not a donor. And so that's where we lose a lot of that discourse now.
I have a question with regard to what's happening. We kept hearing as the election began that it looked like the Republican Party was in deep trouble. They were going to split. There were going to be the never Trumps and the Trumpers. And so we go through this. We weren't thinking about the Democratic Party splitting apart. And as it turns out, Trump won. He got those that criticized him all the way. He's now moving some into his administration. And the Trumpers won, and he preempted those that opposed him, and the Democrats are now falling. What do they need to do?
Well, I think, one, they really are going to have to re-examine their platform. I think this election, if anything else, showed that there's a large segment of American society they're not reaching and they're not speaking to anymore. I think there's the old New Deal alignment that they assumed labor unions were going to go with them. They assumed that working class were going to go with them. And I think that assumption has been eroded from the 1990s forward. The more the Republican Party delved into social issues, the more they split the working class and the old Democratic alignment. And the Democrats simply haven't been willing to move forward. I think they appeal on the environmental issues, they appeal on certain economic issues and a lot of their own social issues, independent of the Republicans straying away from abortion, same-sex marriage, and such things. But I think this is where the Democratic Party really has to sit down and realize that their message so far appeals to a minority of Americans.
How would you rebuild them?
I don't know if the Democratic Party must rebuild, but reorganize in certain districts that they have thoroughly abandoned, like the Midwest, the Rust Belt. I mean, they need to recapture those votes with a discourse that makes those workers feel more inclusive. It's very telling that the unions that were traditionally Democratic supporters are now the voters. I mean, the unions may donate to the Democratic Party, but the workers themselves voted Republican, right? Which is very telling. So how are you going to reorganize? I would say better to recapture those votes, because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, if you analyze their policies and their party platforms, they are very centrist. But when to win elections, they have to polarize the electorate and win as much votes as they can. So they need to recapture the center. Whoever is able to do that, because the Democratic Party, after all, won the popular vote by 2 million. Right? So it's not that they need to recapture, but reorganize, but recapture the votes in those states, and they have a viable way.
If I can sneak this in.
Okay.
What the Democrats have failed to do, really in competition with Republicans, is the Republicans going back to the 1980s realized that if they wanted to control Congress, then they wanted to control the states.
Right.
And the state houses control policy, they control redistricting. And essentially whoever controls the states controls Congress and essentially has a leg up on mobilizing for the presidency. And for over 30 years now, the Republicans have had a lock on the state houses. And the Democrats have either been unwilling or unable to mobilize and compete at that level.
So they're going to have to start locally.
They are.
Organizing locally, getting voter registration drives, getting organized in the communities. Their precinct captains more active than they've been before. Is that where they need to go?
Well, hopefully that will work because people are demoralized and tired of the two parties, right? That's the other. That's mainstream. Hopefully it'll work. I think any democracy with a presidential system tends to have two parties, right? And then, the United States is not the exception around the world. But sadly, the people around the world are getting tired of two-party politics. If you think about it, society is more individualist now than it was communitarian before. Like everybody has its own identity, its own wants, and those parties appeal to masses rather than individuals. So it's really hard to make the connection. I see it in my students, the millennials, do not connect with the political parties at all.
Okay, he said he was going to drain the swamp, but he's bringing people from the past in. You think that's important for him, for stability in the new administration? And with all the things he said, he's now reversing himself on some of them?
I think there's two different games at play here. And so you mentioned the never Trump split within the party. And I think what he's done pretty masterfully is convince the party that unified government under Republicans with Trump was a better alternative than divided government with Hillary Clinton as president. And so he's had made deals with the Republican Party. Reince Priebus got the Republican Party mobilized to turn out the vote for him.
Right.
Something we haven't talked about.
He could not do it by himself.
No, he couldn't. But the Republican Party organized, and a lot of the media just didn't talk about that. But the turnout factor in certain states pulled him ahead. And now this is payback that the party regulars are being brought in. And a very conservative side of the party, and
Right.
very much the Tea Party
Right.
side of the party. And I think the other game that's afoot right now deals with the Electoral College. So the stories are already out that there may be defectors, faithless electors. And essentially, Trump is nominating people into his cabinet right now that appeal to a certain part of the Republican Party. And I believe that's a sign to the electors that they should stay with him and keep their support of him.
Very good observation. Last word, we're getting to the end.
Well, in the end, it doesn't matter how the candidates got there. The important thing is that we have a president that works, that is able to carry on the mission of pulling the country where it's at forward and recover the economy, recover jobs, and whoever it is, and however he got there, I think we must wish him well, because if he does well, we do well. That's my take. And if you want to protest of taking over, I rather you protest the administration rather than the election. That's good.
Well, we're praying that things go well. At EPCC TV, I'm Leon Blevins, candidate for president.